I came home after 3 weeks away, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening in my own house. Instead, I found every piece of my life dumped on the front lawn. My clothes, my photo albums, even the picture of my late husband were scattered across the grass like garbage. And standing in the doorway was my daughter-in-law, looking at it all like it meant nothing. She told me it was just trash and that the house needed a fresh start. What she did not realize in that moment was simple. She had not thrown away my life. She had just started a war she could not win. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 68 years old, a widow, and until recently I believed I understood exactly what my life had become. Quiet mornings, a small garden, the same wooden house on Hawthorne Boulevard in Portland, Oregon that my husband and I bought more than 30 years ago. It was never a grand home, but it held every memory that mattered to me. My husband Daniel and I purchased that house after years of working long hours at our little neighborhood bakery. We used to wake before dawn to bake bread and cinnamon rolls for the morning customers. Every dollar we saved slowly turned into something solid. New windows, repaired siding, a small vegetable garden in the backyard. That house represented our entire adult life. It represented every sacrifice we made to raise our children. When Daniel passed away 10 years ago, the house became quieter than I ever imagined possible. For a while, I thought about selling it. The rooms felt too large for one person, but every corner held a piece of him. The rose bushes he planted by the fence still bloom every spring. The kitchen still smells faintly of sugar and yeast because I spent so many years testing bakery recipes there. Leaving it would have felt like leaving him behind, so I stayed. 3 years ago, my son Ethan came to me with a request. Portland had grown expensive, and he and his new wife Vanessa were struggling to keep up with the rent. They asked if they could move into the house temporarily while they saved money for a place of their own. It seemed like a simple decision at the time. Ethan was my son. Helping him felt natural. I told them they could stay as long as they needed. All I asked for was respect for the home and honesty within the family. They both promised me that would never be a problem. Until recently, I believed them. 3 weeks before everything changed, I traveled to Seattle, Washington to care for my older sister. She had suffered a stroke and needed help while recovering in the hospital. I stayed with her through doctor appointments and long evenings in a rehabilitation center. During that time, I rarely thought about my own house. I trusted Ethan and Vanessa to take care of things. When the doctors finally told me my sister was stable enough for professional care, I booked a taxi and headed back to Portland. The afternoon I returned was cold and gray, the kind of rainy Oregon day that makes you want to curl up indoors with tea. I remember leaning back in the taxi seat, exhausted but relieved. All I wanted was to unlock my front door, step into the familiar quiet of my living room, and finally sleep in my own bed. When the taxi turned onto Hawthorne Boulevard, I immediately noticed something strange. At first, I thought one of the neighbors might be having a yard sale. There were boxes scattered across my lawn and plastic bags piled near the walkway. But as the taxi slowed to a stop in front of my house, my stomach tightened. Those were not yard sale boxes. They were my belongings. I stepped out of the taxi slowly, my heart pounding in confusion. Cardboard containers sat open in the wet grass. My winter coats were stuffed into trash bags. A framed photograph of Daniel lay face down in the mud. The longer I looked, the worse it became. Kitchen utensils, books, photo albums, even old baking notebooks were scattered across the yard like discarded junk. Then I saw the cardboard box near the walkway. A sheet of paper was taped to the side, written in thick black marker. 2 words, trash, free to take. In that moment, I realized something inside my own home had changed while I was gone. If you're still watching and this moment caught your attention, comment number 1 below so I know you're here with me. Because what I found on that lawn was only the beginning, and what happened next inside the house was far worse. Now let's move on to chapter 2. For several seconds, I could not move. The rain had begun again, light but steady, tapping softly against the cardboard boxes scattered across my lawn. I stood there staring at the objects that had once filled my home, trying to understand how they had ended up outside like discarded junk. Slowly, I walked toward the nearest box. The first thing I picked up was a photograph frame lying face down in the wet grass. Mud clung to the glass. When I wiped it with the sleeve of my coat, Daniel's face appeared beneath the smudges. It was the photograph taken the summer we opened the bakery, the year we finally believed our hard work might give us a future. For a moment, I simply held it in my hands. Then I noticed the recipe box. It was the old metal container where I had kept handwritten baking notes for more than 30 years. Inside were the recipes for our cinnamon rolls, our sourdough bread, even the blackberry pie that used to sell out every Sunday afternoon. Now the lid was half open, and several recipe cards were scattered across the lawn, their ink beginning to blur in the rain. I crouched down and gathered them carefully. Everywhere I looked, there were pieces of my life. My winter coat, a stack of books from the living room shelf, a small ceramic bowl Daniel bought during a road trip along the Oregon coast. Nothing had been packed carefully. Boxes were ripped open, and plastic bags hung loosely from the bushes. This was not cleaning. This was removal. At first, my mind tried to invent reasonable explanations. Perhaps Ethan and Vanessa had planned to sort through everything later. Perhaps they believed I no longer needed some of these things. But the sign on the cardboard box destroyed every excuse. Trash. Free to take. Those words sat there in thick black marker like a public declaration that my memories were worthless. I was still staring at the sign when the front door opened. Vanessa stepped outside holding a coffee mug. She wore a pale sweater, and her hair was styled as if she were preparing for an ordinary afternoon. Her eyes moved briefly across the yard, then settled on me. There was no surprise in her expression. If anything, she seemed mildly irritated that I had arrived sooner than expected. I waited for her to say something that might explain what I was seeing. Instead, she glanced toward the scattered boxes again and shrugged slightly. Her tone carried a calm confidence that made the scene even stranger. She explained that she had decided to clear out unnecessary items from the house. According to her reasoning, the space needed a fresh start. The words were delivered casually, as though labeling someone else's belongings as garbage required no further thought. Behind her, inside the doorway, Ethan appeared. My son stood there, with one hand resting against the doorframe. His shoulders looked tense, but he said nothing. When our eyes met, he quickly looked down at the floor. That silence hurt more than anything Vanessa had done. I realized then that this had not happened in secret. Ethan had seen every box carried outside. He had watched every object placed in the yard, and he had allowed it. Vanessa continued talking about redecorating and reorganizing the house. She spoke about creating space for a new chapter of family life, as though my presence had simply become outdated furniture. Anger rose inside me, but it came with an unexpected clarity. I studied the lawn once more, then looked directly at her. "If you want to clean the house," I said quietly, "then we will finish the job." She seemed satisfied with that answer. While she turned toward the door, believing the conversation was over, I reached into my coat pocket and took out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a familiar name, Harold Lawson, the lawyer who handled Daniel's estate. I pressed the call button and listened to the ringing tone while rain continued to fall across the lawn of my own house. If you're still here and feeling the tension building, comment number 2 below to let me know you're still with the story, because the truth about what had been happening in that house while I was gone was about to shock even me. Now, let's continue with Chapter 3. The phone rang only twice before Harold Lawson answered. I kept my voice steady and told him I needed to see him the next morning. I did not explain everything over the phone. I simply said that something serious had happened with my house. Harold paused for a moment before agreeing to meet me at his office in downtown Portland. His tone carried the quiet professionalism I remembered from years earlier when he helped settle Daniel's estate. When the call ended, the yard felt strangely silent. Rain continued to fall in a thin mist over the boxes scattered across the lawn. I knew I could not save everything before it was soaked through, but there were a few things I could not leave outside. I started with Daniel's photograph, wrapping it carefully inside my coat. Then I gathered the metal recipe box and the leather notebook where I had always kept household records and property papers. Those items were small enough to carry, but they represented the most important pieces of my past. As I moved through the yard, I began noticing something else. Some of the boxes did not contain my belongings at all. One of them held decorative pillows wrapped in plastic packaging. Another contained a set of wine glasses that looked brand new. There were also unopened kitchen appliances still sealed in cardboard. None of those items had ever been part of my house before. For a moment, I simply stared at them. It meant that while my things had been thrown outside, other items had been moving into the house. The thought unsettled me more than the rain or the mess. I carried the rescued belongings into the garage and set them on an old workbench Daniel built many years ago. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and damp wood, a familiar scent that reminded me of quiet weekends when Daniel used to repair tools there. But even the garage had changed. The storage cabinets along the wall were half empty, and several of my gardening tools had been pushed aside to make space for new cardboard boxes stacked near the back. Curiosity pulled me toward one of them. The lid was open just enough for me to see folded papers inside. I did not intend to examine them closely, but one sheet slipped out when I lifted the box. It was a printed receipt. At first, the document meant nothing to me. It contained dates, reservation numbers, and payment amounts. But when my eyes moved down the page, I noticed the address listed at the top. My address. I unfolded the paper and read more carefully. The receipt mentioned short-term rental stays and guest check-in information. A familiar company logo appeared at the corner of the page. Airbnb. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. The basement of my house had a small private entrance that Daniel built years ago so relatives could stay there during holidays. We rarely used it after the bakery closed, but it was still fully furnished. Another receipt appeared underneath the first one. Then another. The dates stretched back month after month. Each document listed a payment amount transferred to an account I did not recognize. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Someone had been renting out part of my house to strangers. I remembered Eleanor Briggs mentioning unfamiliar visitors arriving with suitcases earlier that year. At the time, I had assumed they were friends of Ethan and Vanessa. Now the truth stood in front of me on those printed pages. Vanessa had turned my basement into a rental property. I sat down slowly on the wooden stool beside the workbench and began folding the receipts carefully. Each one went into the leather notebook beside my financial records. By the time darkness settled outside the garage door, the rain had stopped. But the quiet felt different now. The boxes on the lawn still represented humiliation. The papers in my notebook represented something far more serious. They were proof. If you're still watching and curious about where this is going, comment number 3 below, so I know you're following along. Because the papers I found in that garage revealed something I never imagined, and it was only the first piece of the puzzle. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image waiting for me on the lawn. Boxes in the rain. My husband's photograph lying in the mud. The word trash written in thick black marker, as if the last 40 years of my life could be reduced to something disposable. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, I gave up on the idea of sleep. Portland mornings are usually quiet. The streets along Hawthorne Boulevard remain calm before the traffic begins. I stood in my kitchen making coffee, while the house around me felt unfamiliar, almost borrowed. Ethan and Vanessa were still asleep upstairs, or at least they had not come downstairs while I was awake. That silence suited me. I dressed carefully before leaving the house, not because anyone expected it, but because I needed to remind myself who I was. A clean coat, sensible shoes, the same leather notebook I had carried for years when managing the bakery accounts. Inside the notebook, I placed the printed Airbnb receipts I had collected from the garage. When I stepped outside, the yard still looked exactly as it had the night before. The rain had stopped, but the boxes remained scattered across the lawn. Several of them had collapsed from the moisture, their contents partially exposed. My winter coat still hung over the branch of a rose bush where someone had tossed it carelessly. No one had tried to fix the mess. That detail confirmed what I already suspected. The humiliation had not been an accident. It had been a decision. I drove downtown slowly, following familiar streets toward the courthouse district where Harold Lawson's office had been located for more than 2 decades. The brick building stood between a coffee shop and a small insurance agency. I had visited that office years earlier after Daniel passed away, when Harold helped settle the estate and finalize the paperwork for the bakery. Walking inside felt strangely comforting. Harold greeted me with the same calm professionalism I remembered. His office looked unchanged, filled with shelves of neatly organized legal files and framed certificates hanging on the walls. I placed my leather notebook on his desk and opened it. He studied the Airbnb receipts quietly, turning each page with careful attention. The silence stretched long enough that I began to hear the ticking of the wall clock behind him. When he finally spoke, his voice remained steady. He asked me a question about the ownership of my house. I explained that Ethan and Vanessa had moved in 3 years earlier, but that I had never signed documents transferring ownership or creating a formal lease agreement. Harold leaned back in his chair and opened a property file from his cabinet. After reviewing several pages, he confirmed something I had not fully considered. The house was still legally registered entirely in my name. Ethan and Vanessa were living there only because I had allowed it. Harold then explained that the Airbnb receipts raised additional concerns. Renting out part of the property without the owner's permission could involve unauthorized commercial use. He also pointed to the printed bank notification I had found among the papers. That document suggested a debit card connected to my retirement account might have been used recently. He advised me to review my bank statements immediately. Before I left his office, Harold outlined several steps to protect myself: securing my accounts, documenting the rental activity, preparing legal notice if necessary. When I stepped back onto the Portland sidewalk, the city moved around me as it always had. But I felt something different inside. Yesterday, I believed I had been pushed out of my own home. Now I knew the truth. The house had never stopped being mine. If you're still here and the story is getting under your skin, comment number 4 below so I know you're still with me. because when I walked back into that house later that day, something was happening inside that changed everything. Now, let's continue to Chapter 5. When I left Harold Lawson's office, the air outside felt colder than it had that morning. Downtown Portland was busy as usual, with people moving quickly along the sidewalks and traffic humming through the intersections. Everything looked normal. But inside my mind, the world had shifted. The house was still legally mine. That fact repeated itself in my thoughts as I walked toward my car. The knowledge did not erase what had happened on my lawn the day before, but it gave the situation a different shape. What I had believed to be helplessness was no longer real. Before returning home, I followed Harold's advice and drove to my bank. The branch near Pioneer Courthouse Square had not changed much over the years. The same polished counters, the same quiet atmosphere where voices rarely rose above polite conversation. I approached the customer service desk and asked a representative to review my retirement account activity from the past year. She printed several pages and handed them to me. I sat at a small desk in the corner of the lobby and began reading. The first few transactions looked ordinary. Utility payments, property taxes, grocery purchases. But as I moved further down the pages, the numbers changed. Large withdrawals appeared again and again. Furniture stores, clothing retailers, online travel reservations, electronics purchases. Each charge had been processed through a debit card connected to my retirement savings account, a card I almost never used. The amounts added up quickly. By the time I reached the end of the statement, the total exceeded $70,000. I closed my eyes for a moment. The bank lobby remained calm around me, but inside my chest something tightened. I did not raise my voice or create a scene. Instead, I returned to the desk and requested that the debit card be frozen immediately. I also asked for printed copies of the transaction history so I could provide them to my attorney. The representative completed the request and handed me the documents. I left the bank carrying a folder that felt heavier than paper should. When I drove back toward Hawthorne Boulevard later that afternoon, I noticed something unusual before I even reached my driveway. Cars were parked along the curb outside my house, several of them. Music drifted through the open windows as I stepped out of my car. Laughter followed, mixed with the clinking sound of glasses and casual conversation. For a moment, I simply stood there. Vanessa was hosting a gathering. The front door stood partially open. Through the doorway, I could see people walking through the living room, holding drinks, admiring the interior as if they were visiting a newly purchased property. I walked up the steps and entered quietly. The room looked different from the way I remembered it. Some of my furniture had disappeared. In its place were sleek modern pieces that did not belong to the home Daniel and I built together. Decorative pillows covered the sofa, and bright lamps filled corners that once held family photographs. A few guests glanced at me briefly, assuming I was another arrival. Across the room, Vanessa stood beside the kitchen island, speaking animatedly to a small group. When she noticed me, surprise flashed across her face for only a second before her expression returned to confidence. Ethan appeared near the hallway, shifting uneasily as he noticed my presence. No one approached me. Instead of confronting anyone, I stepped back outside onto the porch. From there, I could see the driveway filled with unfamiliar cars and hear voices drifting through the windows. The celebration continued as if the house already belonged to someone else. I removed my phone from my coat pocket and sent Harold a brief message describing the situation. Then I began taking photographs. Each parked car, each guest entering the house, each glimpse of the party through the windows. Inside, Vanessa continued hosting, as if she owned everything around her. But standing there on the porch, I understood something she clearly did not. The more she celebrated, the more evidence she created. I stood on the front porch for several minutes after finishing the photographs. The evening air had cooled, and the sound of music drifted through the open windows of the living room. Laughter followed every few seconds, bright and careless, as if the house behind me had always belonged to the people celebrating inside. My phone vibrated quietly in my hand. Harold Lawson had responded to my message. His reply was brief and professional. He advised me not to start an argument and reminded me that documentation was far more valuable than confrontation. According to him, the information I had already gathered was strong enough to begin building a legal record if necessary. I slipped the phone back into my coat pocket. For a moment, I considered simply leaving the property and letting the evening unfold without my presence. But the thought passed quickly. The house was still mine, and hiding from the situation would only allow Vanessa to continue shaping the story however she wished. So I turned and walked back inside. The living room looked even more crowded than before. Guests moved between the kitchen and the hallway carrying drinks while music played from a speaker near the window. A few people were standing near the staircase that led to the basement, speaking with curiosity as if they were exploring a newly purchased home. The sight made something inside me tighten. Daniel and I had built that basement space carefully, planning it as a quiet guest suite for visiting relatives. Now, strangers wandered past the doorway as though it were part of a tour. I walked slowly across the room. Several people glanced at me briefly, then returned to their conversations. To them, I was simply another person attending the gathering. None of them realized they were standing inside a house that had been taken from its owner. Vanessa noticed me again near the center of the room. Her expression hardened slightly before she moved toward me with controlled confidence. She asked why I was still there. Her tone suggested that my presence was an inconvenience rather than a right. I studied her for a moment, noticing how comfortable she appeared in the role she had created for herself. To her friends, she likely seemed like the host of a beautiful home, someone proudly showing off a new chapter of life. Behind her, Ethan stepped into view near the hallway. His shoulders were tense, and his eyes moved between Vanessa and me, as though he sensed trouble approaching. I turned toward him instead of answering Vanessa directly. Calmly, I asked whether he understood who legally owned the house we were standing in. The question seemed to confuse him. For a moment, he simply stared at me, as if the idea had never occurred to him before. I explained that earlier that morning, I had visited Harold Lawson and reviewed the official property records. The document still listed my name as the sole owner. The atmosphere around us shifted almost immediately. A few guests nearby grew quiet as fragments of the conversation reached them. Vanessa attempted to dismiss the statement with a quick explanation about future plans and family arrangements, but her confidence was no longer as solid as it had been earlier. I mentioned the Airbnb receipts and the bank transactions connected to my retirement account. I did not raise my voice. I simply stated the facts. Ethan's expression changed as he processed the information. Confusion replaced embarrassment, followed by something closer to concern. That was all I needed. I turned toward the door and stepped outside once more, leaving the conversation behind me. Inside the house, the music continued, but the laughter had faded. For the first time that evening, the party no longer sounded carefree. If you're still watching and wondering how this confrontation will end, comment number 6 below so I know you're still here. Because what happened after that party ended shook the entire house, and the truth was only beginning to surface. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. I remained on the front porch long after the door closed behind me. Inside the house, the music continued for a while, but the energy had changed. Earlier, the sound of laughter had been loud enough to drift all the way to the street. Now the voices were lower, uncertain, as though something invisible had settled over the room. I leaned against the porch railing and watched the driveway. It did not take long for the first guest to leave. A couple stepped out of the front door carrying their coats. They moved quickly down the walkway, speaking to each other in quiet tones. Neither of them looked back at the house. A few minutes later, 2 more people followed, then another small group. Within half an hour, the row of parked cars along the curb began to disappear. The party was dissolving without anyone officially ending it. From where I stood, I could see through the living room window. Vanessa moved across the room with the tight, controlled gestures, gathering empty glasses from the table. Ethan stood near the kitchen doorway, speaking to someone who appeared ready to leave. His shoulders were tense, his posture uncertain. Eventually, the music stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had been. I waited until the last unfamiliar car pulled away before opening the front door again. The air inside the house smelled faintly of spilled wine and perfume. Paper napkins and empty plates covered the kitchen counter, and several chairs had been pushed aside to create space for the gathering earlier. The room that once belonged to Daniel and me now looked like the aftermath of a stranger's celebration. Vanessa stood near the sink, rinsing glasses with sharp, impatient movements. Ethan was pacing slowly across the living room floor. Neither of them noticed me at first. Their voices were low but tense. Vanessa spoke quickly, her words clipped and defensive. Ethan responded more slowly, asking questions that seemed to frustrate her even further. I could not hear every sentence clearly, but the argument had already begun before I walked back inside. Ethan finally turned and saw me standing near the doorway. His expression changed immediately. The frustration faded from his face and was replaced by something closer to uncertainty. For a moment, he looked almost like the boy who used to sit at the bakery counter doing homework while Daniel and I closed the shop for the night. He walked toward me cautiously. His voice was quieter than it had been earlier when the house was full of guests. He asked whether the information I mentioned about the house and the bank records was true. I told him that the documents existed and that Harold Lawson was already reviewing them. I did not raise my voice or accuse anyone directly. The facts spoke clearly enough on their own. Ethan's eyes widened slightly as he absorbed the meaning of what I said. The amount of money involved seemed to surprise him more than anything else. Before he could say anything further, Vanessa turned sharply from the sink. Her face was tight with anger, but there was also something else behind it, something more calculated. She crossed the room and interrupted the conversation with a sudden announcement. According to her, everything needed to stop. She said she was pregnant. The words hung in the air between us. Ethan looked at her with open shock, as if hearing the news for the first time. His confusion was unmistakable. Whatever conversation had happened between them earlier in their marriage, this information had not been part of it. I studied Vanessa carefully. Her posture was rigid, her voice controlled in a way that suggested preparation rather than surprise. The room fell completely silent. Around us, the remains of the party sat abandoned on the tables and counters. The celebration had ended. Now only the truth remained in the room with us. The words Vanessa had spoken still hung in the air long after she finished saying them. Pregnant. For a moment, none of us moved. The living room felt unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. The faint smell of wine and perfume from the earlier gathering lingered in the air, mixing with the uneasy silence that had replaced the music. Ethan was the first to react. His eyes remained fixed on Vanessa, searching her face as though he were trying to understand whether he had heard correctly. The surprise on his expression was unmistakable. If he had known about the pregnancy before that moment, he was doing an excellent job pretending otherwise. He asked her when she had found out. Vanessa crossed her arms and shifted her weight slightly, answering with a calmness that felt rehearsed rather than natural. According to her explanation, she had only discovered the news recently and had not yet decided how to share it. Her answer sounded simple, but something about it felt incomplete. I did not interrupt. Instead, I watched carefully. Years of running a small business had taught me that people reveal more through hesitation than through confident speech. Vanessa's voice remained steady, but the details of her explanation were vague. She did not mention a doctor's appointment or a medical visit. She simply repeated that she had learned the news not long ago. Ethan continued looking at her, absorbing the information slowly. The possibility of becoming a father clearly unsettled him. I could see the mixture of emotions crossing his face: hope, confusion, concern. The idea of a child had suddenly entered a conversation that only minutes earlier had been about legal ownership and financial records. Vanessa seemed to sense his hesitation. She began speaking about the future, describing how the family should focus on preparing for the baby instead of arguing about property or money. Her tone carried a quiet urgency, as though the announcement itself should erase everything that had been discussed earlier that evening. I remained calm. I simply reminded them that certain matters could not disappear because circumstances changed. The bank records existed. The rental documents existed. Harold Lawson was already reviewing the situation. My voice stayed level, almost quiet. Facts rarely need dramatic delivery. Vanessa's expression tightened as she listened. Her earlier confidence had faded, replaced by frustration she struggled to hide. Ethan spoke again after a moment. This time his question was practical. He asked whether she had visited a doctor yet. Vanessa paused. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough. She responded that she intended to schedule an appointment soon and had not yet had time to see anyone. Her explanation sounded rushed, as if she were assembling it while speaking. I noticed the change in Ethan's posture immediately. The excitement that had appeared in his expression a few moments earlier faded slightly. Doubt replaced it, subtle but unmistakable. Vanessa attempted to redirect the conversation again, but Ethan had already begun asking about the financial records I mentioned earlier. Their voices lowered into a tense exchange. I realized there was nothing more I needed to say that night. Quietly, I stepped away from the living room and walked down the hallway toward the guest bedroom. Behind me, their argument continued in low voices, growing sharper as the minutes passed. When I reached the end of the hallway, I paused briefly. Vanessa's announcement had been meant to silence the conflict. Instead, it had created questions. And questions, once spoken aloud, have a way of uncovering the truth. If you're still with the story and want to see how everything finally unfolds, comment number 8 below, so I know you're here to the end. Because what happened the next morning revealed the truth behind everything, and it led to the final outcome of this story. Now, let's move into the ending of the story. I woke early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen over Portland. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm has passed, but before anyone is certain what damage remains. For a moment I lay still, listening. No music, no voices, only the faint sound of traffic in the distance along Hawthorne Boulevard. When I walked into the kitchen, the signs of the party had mostly disappeared. The empty glasses and paper napkins from the night before were gone, and the counters had been wiped clean. Someone had clearly spent time restoring order during the night. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table. He looked as though he had not slept at all. His shoulders were slumped forward, and his eyes carried the dull heaviness of someone who had spent hours thinking about things he could not easily fix. He looked up when I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he began explaining that he had spent most of the night going through financial records. After our conversation in the living room, he could not ignore the questions that had been raised. He checked the purchases Vanessa had claimed were paid from her personal account. Many of them matched the transactions listed on the bank statement connected to my retirement account. The realization had shaken him. I listened quietly while he spoke. His voice was tired and uneven, but there was sincerity behind every word. For the first time since the situation began, he seemed willing to face what had happened rather than look away from it. He admitted that he had ignored several warning signs over the past year. Vanessa often handled the finances and made purchases without discussing them in detail. At the time, he accepted her explanations because questioning them felt easier than starting an argument. Now those decisions look different. He also told me that he had asked Vanessa more questions about the pregnancy. When he pressed her for details about a doctor or a medical appointment, she became defensive and refused to answer clearly. Early that morning, she packed several bags. She said she needed time away from the tension in the house. Ethan did not know where she went, only that she left quickly and without explaining much. The kitchen grew quiet again after he finished speaking. Then he apologized. The apology was not dramatic. It was simple and heavy with regret. He admitted that standing silent while my belongings were thrown onto the lawn was something he would carry with him for a long time. I told him that trust could not be repaired overnight, but acknowledging the truth was the first step. Later that morning, I walked outside into the backyard. The rose bushes Daniel planted along the fence were beginning to bloom again. Their petals opened slowly in the cool air, untouched by the conflict that had filled the house only hours earlier. I stood there for several minutes, breathing in the scent of the garden. The truth had finally surfaced. Now the future would depend on what we chose to do with it. Several months have passed since the night everything finally began to unravel inside my house on Hawthorne Boulevard. Time has a quiet way of revealing the full shape of events that once felt chaotic. What seemed overwhelming in the moment eventually settles into something clearer, something easier to understand. The legal matters took longer than I expected, but the facts never changed. Harold Lawson worked carefully with the bank and the financial records I had collected. The investigation confirmed that the withdrawals from my retirement account had been made using access Vanessa arranged without my knowledge. The Airbnb reservations were also traced directly to accounts she controlled. The house had never belonged to her. In the end, the consequences followed naturally from the truth. Vanessa never returned to live here after the morning she left. The explanations she offered grew weaker as more information appeared. Eventually, Ethan filed for divorce, once it became impossible to ignore the extent of what had happened. I did not celebrate that outcome. Broken relationships rarely feel like victory. Ethan has spent the months since then trying to repair the damage in ways that matter. He cooperated with the financial investigation and began repaying the money connected to the withdrawals. The process will take time, but effort speaks louder than promises. He also chose to move into a small apartment closer to his work. That decision returned something important to me, the quiet independence of my own home. Slowly, the house has begun to feel like itself again. Some of the modern furniture Vanessa brought in has disappeared, replaced by the pieces Daniel and I chose together years ago. The framed photographs are back on their shelves. The kitchen once again smells faintly of cinnamon when I bake on Sunday mornings. Outside, the yard has recovered as well. I repaired the garden beds and cleaned the lawn where my belongings once lay scattered in the rain. The rose bushes Daniel planted along the fence have grown stronger this season. Their blooms fill the backyard with color that feels almost symbolic. Sometimes I sit in the garden during the afternoon and think about the moment that started everything. The moment when someone looked at the life I built and called it trash. Now I understand something important. That word never described my belongings. It revealed the value Vanessa placed on things she did not understand. This house holds decades of work, memory, and love. And no one gets to decide its worth except the person who lived that story. Sometimes life teaches its hardest lessons through moments that feel deeply unfair. When something we built with love is treated as if it has no value, the pain can feel overwhelming. Yet those moments often reveal something important about dignity and self-respect. The things we protect, our homes, our memories, our years of effort, are more than objects. They are chapters of a life lived with purpose. And when someone chooses to stand calmly for what is right, truth has a way of rising to the surface. Strength does not always appear as anger or revenge. Often, it appears as quiet determination, patience, and the courage to draw a line where respect must begin. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. And if you enjoy stories like this, consider following and subscribing so you do not miss the next one.